All right, sounds good. Well, welcome to our weekly seminar series. Today, it's our pleasure to host virtually Dr. Melissa Wilson. She's an associate professor and extension specialist at University of Minnesota. She's in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. She is originally from Pennsylvania, but has obtained her master's and PhD in water resources from University of Minnesota. She is their manure nutrient management expert, and she does some really cool stuff with manure that I get to see whenever I go on Twitter. She worked in our ag nutrient management program here at University of Maryland with Trish Steenhelber, and I know how much she has appreciated the things that you have done for the program. She took her current position in Minnesota in 2017. And today she's going to talk about manure. I'm sure you all know that we have a lot of manure here in Maryland. And from what I learned from Melissa, they also have a lot of manure. So I'm looking forward to her sharing some of the things that she's been doing since she moved back to Minnesota 5 years ago. Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks everyone so much for having me. It's nice to be able to talk to you all, especially because I'm kind of got my start in manure, so to speak, in Maryland, and learned all the rules and regulations there. So it's kind of fun comparing and contrasting what I've learned in Minnesota to my time in Maryland. So today I'm going to talk about some of the things that we are doing to use manure, which is a locally generated nutrient source. Wanted to kind of set the stage for where we are in Minnesota and what we have going on. We have roughly 23,000 registered feedlots in the state. And feedlots are anywhere where animals are being confined and fed at least part of the year. So we only have about 17 to 20,000 that are active. There are a lot of feedlots that might only be a feedlot for a couple months in the winter. Otherwise, animals are grazing, that sort of thing. So overall, roughly 17 to 20,000 are actively confining and feeding animals. You know, there's some estimates about how much manure those animals create, and best guess right now is 50 million metric tons of manure generated annually. And you can kind of see in this photo here where the different livestock species are. The blue shows where the beef cattle are raised. Most are raised on pasture or open feedlots. We do have some, particularly in southwestern Minnesota, that are starting to be raised on slatted floors where the manure is being collected as a liquid and applied that way. So that's a little bit different, but we're starting to see more of that. We have a big dairy industry. I think we're 7th or 6th in the country. We actually just surpassed Pennsylvania. A lot of dairy in the central part of the state and southeastern corner. We're actually #1 for turkeys. So, you know, I dealt with a lot of poultry litter out on the eastern shore of Maryland, and we have lots of poultry litter here in Minnesota as well. And then we have a very large swine population. We go back and forth with North Carolina with swine numbers. And I think right now we are ranked #2 in the country for swine production. And that tends to be kind of in the southern half of the state, particularly in this southwestern and south central areas. Despite having all of these animals, though, we actually still have a lot of ag production land. So this manure only goes on about 25 to 40%, depending on year and cropping sequence of our agricultural land in the state. So despite having so many animals, we still have a lot of land where this manure can be applied. Of course, there are areas, you know, where there's high livestock densities that make it more difficult to get that manure applied. So we do still have some hot spots in our state. Some of our big manure challenges are, you know, changing climate. A lot of our research that was done for nutrient availability for manure was done in the 90s, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes. And since then, we were seeing wetter springs and fall when manure is typically applied. And we're seeing you know, a lot more spikes in really big rain events, which can potentially affect like runoff and those sorts of things. So because of these changing weather conditions, we not only have effects on our nutrient availability, but we also have application windows are becoming shorter or more unpredictable. So it's making it more difficult to manage the manure. We also have to look at balancing soil health. Manure can be a really great source of nutrients and carbon for soil microbiomes, but we have to think about the environmental pollution effects. So it's really good to apply manure to the soil, but you don't want to overdo it. And then we have a lot of new technologies coming in. We're seeing more anaerobic digestion coming in. We're seeing more liquid solid separation coming in. So all of those things need to be evaluated on how they affect the nutrient availability of manure and how it acts as a fertilizer. So it's really a balancing game. That's kind of what we're trying to show here with this diagram. We really need to balance the nutrient needs of the crops with the manure and fertilizers and those things to avoid some of the environmental pollution issues that we're seeing across the state. So with that, some of my research themes that I kind of started when I started my position in 2017 are looking at the value of agricultural waste. And I do have that in quotes because I really like to challenge people to think about it not as a waste, but as a resource, because it is, locally generated. So we're also looking at things like mortality compost and those sorts of things. I won't talk about those today, but we're looking at a lot of different agricultural products and seeing how we can use it as a resource. Second, we're looking at opening up that window of opportunity for land applications. So I'll talk about some of our summer application or side dressing into corn as an alternate window of opportunity to get manure applied. And then finally, we're looking at different best management practices for manure application, whether it's timing, whether it's using cover crops, whether it's using certain of these new technologies to apply the manure, all of those sorts of things we're trying to figure out what we can do to get the manure, to get the best bang for the buck for the manure. I'm only going to talk about 2 projects because, as mentioned, we only have a certain amount of time. So I limited myself to 2. We're going to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus crediting of manure, some of that work that we've done, and we're going to talk about side dressing manure as well. So first I'll get into our manure nutrient availability research. Again, we wanted to evaluate our current recommendations for how to calculate nitrogen and phosphorus credits from manure accurate. With climate change going on, with new technologies, we wanted to reassess and see if we needed to update those or if we're still good with what we have. Just in case you haven't worked with manure before, it is a little bit different from fertilizer. If you remember the nitrogen cycle, plants are typically taking up ammonium nitrogen and nitrate nitrogen forms. There's some evidence that they're taking up some organic nitrogen forms. From what I understand, though, that's pretty minimal, so it's almost negligible. We're mostly worried about ammonium and nitrate pools in the soils for crop uptake. But manure doesn't give you both of those. It gives you organic nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. So ammonium's plant available immediately. It's also available for nitrification, so it can convert to nitrate pretty quickly in the soil. We also have a large proportion of nitrogen that's excreted from animals in the organic nitrogen form. And this we often consider to be more of our slow release form of nitrogen. So we have to wait for that to mineralize into the plant available forms, which means it's kind of like the gift that keeps on giving, right? It can last 2 to 3 years where it's still providing nitrogen credits. So quick history of the availability factors of manure, particularly in Minnesota. They're generated in the 1990s based on research that had happened before then. And it's based on the total nitrogen and phosphorus content of manure. So for nitrogen, you send your manure to a lab, you get total nitrogen in the manure, and that's going to be organic nitrogen plus inorganic nitrogen. You multiply that by 1 availability factor. That availability factor depends on how you apply it and what species of animal we're talking about. And then with phosphorus, we actually consider, it doesn't matter what species, doesn't matter how you apply it, all phosphorus in manure is going to be 80% available that first year after application. It's a little bit different than Maryland. In Maryland, they assume that 100% is going to be available, probably a little bit due to our different soil types and our different climate. And nitrogen, they actually split up into the organic nitrogen form, multiply that by a factor, how much will release the first year, second year, et cetera. And they add that to the amount of ammonia that'll be available after application. So there's a factor there as well about how it's applied, how quickly it's incorporated into the soil, et cetera. So that's definitely a difference that was interesting to me coming into Minnesota from Maryland. One of the interesting things about these availability factors, and I'll show you what they look like for Minnesota in a minute here, they're averaged over manure types and handling systems like liquid versus solid. This diagram here, this is our availability factors. It's a little complicated, so I'll kind of walk you through it. Here we have our percent of nitrogen, total nitrogen available per year, and that's what you see in this table. Then we have application type, so broadcast versus injection. Injection is when the manure is injected beneath the soil surface. Broadcast is usually, as it sounds, it's spread right on the surface, and then we consider timing of incorporation as well. So was it quickly within 12 hours? Did it happen between 12 hours or 4 days? Or was it over 4 days, or was it never incorporated? So depending on species then, and what year we're talking about, whether it's the first year after application or the second, you'll get these nitrogen availability factors. You'll notice that with injected manure, which is typically only for liquids, you're going to have your highest availability factors. Or if you broadcast and incorporate it pretty quickly, you'll have pretty high availability factors as well. But then you'll notice these availability factors decrease the longer it takes you to incorporate these manures because of that ammonia portion that's potentially being lost to the atmosphere. Second year availability doesn't matter how you applied it. This is just the organic portion of the nitrogen remaining that will mineralize into the plant available forms for that second year. So you'll notice there are differences between species. Beef and dairy tend to be lower availability factors, particularly in the first year. Swine and poultry tend to be higher availability factors. There's a reason for that. You know, different animal species have different digestive systems and will excrete nitrogen in different forms. The handling system also plays a role. Here we had a couple different labs in Minnesota provided us data on some of the manure samples that they've been running. This is data from 2012 to 2020. And it probably represents about 7,000 manure samples in the upper Midwest. So what we have here is we have had them report to us what form of nitrogen they measured. So in the cases where we had both inorganic and organic forms separated out, we could calculate the total nitrogen. So that's from 0 to 100% at the bottom here. And the yellow portion of the bars shows us how much of that nitrogen was in the organic form. The red portion of the bar on the left here shows us the portion that was the inorganic nitrogen. The numbers here show us the inorganic portion of the nitrogen. And typically this is going to be an ammonia form. When we're talking about manure storage, raw manure storage, there's not that much that's converted to nitrate because these usually tend to be kind of anaerobic. So they don't have a lot of oxygen, they can't convert to nitrate. Then I split it up into liquid handling systems, might also be a slurry handling system as well, incorporated into there, and then solids. And then within each of those, we have different species, swine, dairy, beef. We don't have too much liquid poultry storage in Minnesota or in the upper Midwest. For the solids, we do have swine, dairy, beef, and poultry here on the left. So a couple of things you probably notice right away. One is that liquid manures, regardless of what species, tend to have a way higher inorganic nitrogen content versus the solids have a way lower nitrogen content. One of the things that makes us thinking about nitrogen crediting, or like thinking that we maybe need to reevaluate what we're doing here, is this. We have a lot of swine liquid systems, but we are starting to see an increase in swine solid systems where they're raising swine in hoop barns and those sorts of things. Same with dairy. We're starting to see more and more liquid systems for the newer dairies that are being built, while some of the older dairies that are closing, which are the smaller dairies, do tend to be more of a solid system. So we're seeing shifts in manure types that are found in the upper Midwest. And then that means we're going to see shifts in manure nitrogen distribution. Even with our solid manures, you'll see that poultry has the highest inorganic nitrogen content and still only 26%. So overall, these solid manures really have a lot more nitrogen in the organic form, which means it's going to take a lot longer for it to release over time. So we set up a field experiment. This is one of the first experiments we started when I started at the University of Minnesota. We have 2 research and outreach centers, one in Waseca, Minnesota, which is south central Minnesota, and one in Lamberton, Minnesota, which is southwestern Minnesota. Lamberton tends to be a little bit drier. We found out that in the years where we did this, it's been really wet actually, but Lamberton tends to be drier. Waseca tends to be a little bit wetter and has a much more fertile soil. So we wanted to kind of get different soil types, different weather conditions. And we started 2 sites at each location. One site started in 2018 at both locations, and one site started in 2019. The goal was to get, potentially different weather conditions for these first year, second year, third year manure nutrient availabilities. We then applied 6 different types of manure. We did a bedded beef pack, a liquid dairy manure. We also then had the same farm actually had a solid liquid separation system. So we also have a portion of the separated dairy manure. We have a turkey litter. We have a composted chicken layer manure. And we have a liquid swine finishing barn manure as well. So those are our 6 different types of manure. We applied all of them using our current guidelines to get a first year nitrogen-based rate of 140 pounds of nitrogen. The 140 pounds of nitrogen is the standard recommended practice at the time for corn following soybeans. So that's because basically our goal. We wanted to apply 140 pounds of first year available nitrogen. Then theoretically, we should see, similar yields across manure types, et cetera. For fertilizers, we developed a nitrogen response curve. So we have 5 plots within each replicate that have different fertilizer nitrogen rates. They have full P, full K, but just the nitrogen changes. And then we also have another set of 5 treatments where they have full nitrogen, full potassium, but we just changed the phosphorus rates to develop these response curves so that we can compare manure to see where they kind of fell out within these response curves. So overall, we had 16 treatments. Again, just to kind of reiterate what we did with our fertilizer practices versus manure practices. In year 1, the full nitrogen rate was considered 140 pounds of nitrogen because we were following soybean. In year 2, our full nitrogen rate jumped up to 195 pounds of nitrogen per acre because we're in a continuous corn system. So we don't have that credit from the soybean. Manures were only applied in the first year at the full available nitrogen rate. And then we, determined how much phosphorus was applied there as well. And then our nitrogen fertilizers were applied in the fertilizer only plots or the phosphorus fertilizers. These all had full P and K as needed when we changed the nitrogen rates. And again, with the phosphorus rate curves, only phosphorus has changed, but those had full nitrogen and full potassium. We also applied sulfur as needed. In years 2 and 3, nitrogen rate curves were adjusted a little bit downward, but we adjusted up to get the 195 pounds of nitrogen per acre, but we didn't add 150% of nitrogen then. We only went up to 100% nitrogen because in the manure plots, we didn't apply manure again. We only applied potassium and sulfur. So we knew that the nitrogen availability was going to be a lot lower that second year. So we adjusted that rate curve down a bit. For phosphorus, again, we did apply the same phosphorus rates throughout the project. I'm only going to cover years 1 and 2 just for the sake of time. But I wanted to show you first some pictures to kind of show you what we first started seeing in that first year after we applied manure. So this is spring applied. Here we have a turkey litter plot, and the corn looks really big and lush compared to our bedded beef plot. This picture was taken June 18th at our Waseca site in that first year after manure was applied. And already, remember, we tried to apply 140 pounds from the first year available nitrogen, so they should have been equal. But we could already see that the turkey litter was applying or providing a lot more nitrogen early in the season than this bedded beef pack was. And this first year, the bedded beef pack was a corn stalk was the bedding that was used. Here's a picture mid-July at our Lamberton site. We had 4 replicates. This is all randomized complete block design. I'm showing you labeled replicates 1 and labeled replicate 2. And down at the bottom, you can see everything that was kind of randomized. I like to point out that here's our 0 nitrogen fertilizer. It's the third box here. 4 rows of corn. You can see the corn's pretty yellow. You can even see the rows or the soil between the rows. So the rows haven't fully closed. But if you look at something like here's our swine manure and turkey litter right next to each other, very dark green. You can't really see as much soil between the rows because the canopy has started to close. So those looked very lush, and you can tell they were definitely providing nitrogen. Compared to our bedded beef pack, here again, you can see the soil between the rows. It's very light green. It's looking pretty nitrogen deficient. And we saw that throughout our reps. Again, here's our bedded beef pack one as well. So even early on, we knew that maybe some of our nitrogen crediting aspects needed to be looked at. So here, this is the average yield over all 4 site years. Remember, we had 2 sites in 2018, 2 sites in 2019, and then at different locations. So this is averaged over all 4 of those. We have our manure source at the bottom, swine manure. This is a finishing swine manure, bedded beef pack, raw liquid dairy, separated liquid dairy, chicken layer that was composted, and turkey litter. So overall, we definitely had pretty different results with our manure types. Remember, we had tried to apply all the same first year available nitrogen. Here's our nitrogen rate curve from 0 to 168 pounds of nitrogen. Remember, the goal here was about 140, or that's what the current recommendations are. And then here's our phosphorus rate curve. You can tell the corn was much more responsive to nitrogen than it was phosphorus. But we went from 0 to 120 pounds of phosphorus. But we know that manure isn't just one nutrient source. So we didn't want to try to calculate our nitrogen credits or phosphorus credits just looking at yield. So what we did is we figured out what the nitrogen uptake was from all of these corn plots. So we collected whole plant samples. We collected stalk, cob, grain at the R6 or the black layer of corn. This is when corn has reached maturity before it starts to senesce and start to lose those nutrients again. So this is when, corn should have taken up the most nitrogen that it's going to take up. So here we have nitrogen uptake in pounds per acre from 0 to 160. And you can see again, we have the same layout as before. We have swine manure, beef, the bedded beef pack, dairy manure, separated dairy, chicken layer, and turkey. And then we have the nitrogen uptake from our nitrogen rate response curves. So with our nitrogen rate response curves, we can develop an equation that predicts how much nitrogen was taken up based on how much nitrogen was applied. Then with our manure plots, we can actually compare it to this equation. So we know how much nitrogen was taken up from our swine manure as an example. Where does it fall out in our equation? That gives us what the nitrogen credit essentially was of that particular manure type. So overall, here is our nitrogen fertilizer equivalent value in pounds of nitrogen per acre. Remember, we were aiming for 140 and none got quite there. None of them got to that 140 pounds of nitrogen. Swine finisher got to 100, chicken layer composted got to 118. You can see our bedded beef pack did not fare well. It only provided about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre on average in the first year. The second column shows us the percent nitrogen that was available. So this is the nitrogen fertilizer equivalent value. So column 1 divided by how much total nitrogen we applied. And you can see swine finisher manure is only about 46% available. We estimated based on how we applied it that it would be about 70% available. Bedded beef pack was 10% available. Raw dairy was 24%. The separated dairy was actually slightly higher at 28%, suggesting that removing some of those solids might leave some nitrogen that's slightly more available. And then both our poultry litters were about 34% available that first year. This is what we assumed would be available that first year. So just to give you an idea of what actually happened versus what we assumed would happen. So with phosphorus, we did the same thing. Here we have our phosphorus uptake in pounds per acre. our different manure sources. And then we have our calculation based on how much phosphorus was taken up by the plots or by the phosphorus rate curve corn plots. So then we calculated our fertilizer equivalent value, same way as what we did with our nitrogen. So here's our first year phosphorus equivalent value. Interestingly, our composted chicken layer was 77 pounds of phosphorus per acre. But if you look at the amount of phosphorus that was available compared to how much was applied, that was actually one of our lowest. So it had the highest phosphorus uptake, but we just applied so much phosphorus with this composted chicken layer manure that it actually was a very small percentage of what was applied. One of the surprising things was our swine finisher manure. It supplied about 33 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And this was actually 145% of what we applied. Again, this is really interesting. We don't know why. We are still working on all of our soil samples throughout the season to see if we can tease out what was going on here. But we are wondering if, the phytase that's put into swine diets, phytase is an enzyme that can help them recover phosphorus from their diet a little bit better. But, if that's being excreted, is it also making phosphorus more available in the soil than it would otherwise? So we're wondering if that was maybe something that was happening in these conditions. And we did see this at all 4 site years. So that's our average of the first year. Here we're looking at our second year availability. So this is corn yield in bushels per acre. Remember, we only applied potassium and sulfur fertilizers to these. We did not apply any more nitrogen or phosphorus. That way we could see how much nitrogen and phosphorus was being kind of supplied just by the manure that had been applied the year before. We did apply full nitrogen rate curve and full phosphorus curve as well. But again, we did the same thing where we looked at nitrogen uptake, phosphorus uptake, and calculated the nitrogen fertilizer equivalent value, which you see in this first column, and the phosphorus fertilizer equivalent value, which you see in the second. Nitrogen was pretty low for the second year. We were only getting roughly 5% available nitrogen, and that was fairly consistent across all manure types. And with the phosphorus, it was pretty low for swine and dairy and beef. It was only roughly about 5-6%. We did see a lot more phosphorus availability that second year for the poultry litters, which again is pretty expected because they usually are very good phosphorus sources and that they have a lot of phosphorus in them when they're being applied. So take home messages, we're still working on putting all this data together. We have lots of soil data. We collected soils pretty much once a month in the first year at each site, and then every other month in the second and third years at each site. One of the things that we do know that was very interesting is that both of the years that we did the first year manure application were very wet. I remember 2018 was one of the wetter years on record, and everyone kept saying, oh, well, at least it can't be as bad as that. And then 2019 happened and it was worse. So these are very, very wet years, and we probably lost a lot of nitrogen in that particular first year. So the nitrogen availability was lower, but we think that's because it probably, as it mineralized and nitrified, probably was lost at a faster rate than it would be in more what's considered normal years. And we think that because as we're thinking about where the nitrogen and phosphorus went, the low second and third year availability suggests that nitrogen was lost. It's not like it didn't nitrify or didn't mineralize and was just sitting in the organic form. It seems like it nitrified or mineralized and then, was lost, unfortunately. We will see more when we get all of our in-season soil samples put together, but that was thousands upon thousands of samples, so we're still working through that data. With our phosphorus data, though, it really shows that soil sampling is going to be important in years following manure application, particularly for those poultry litters. And I know, Maryland is very well aware of that, having some of the legacy phosphorus issues, especially with the poultry litters that you experience. So that was one of our first projects, still continuing to work on that. Next project I want to talk about, looks like I still have a little bit of time here, is side dressing manure in corn. This is one of those projects where I was speaking to the commercial manure haulers in our state and telling them that I'm going to do this. And they told me that this was the stupidest idea that they've ever heard. No one's ever going to do this. And I was like, well, I'm going to try anyways, because why not? I like to joke that my research program is doing dumb things so farmers don't have to. So why would you even consider side dressing manure? Well, one, we have a need for improved nutrient management. We know that the best time to apply nutrients is when the crops need it, rather than applying it well in advance and hoping that it's still there. We also know that we have fewer days for manure application as our spring and fall seasons are getting wetter and wetter in Minnesota, unpredictably so. It's making it difficult for manure to be applied in an environmentally friendly manner. So having an alternative window of opportunity can be really beneficial. The other thing that we have going on is that, a lot of our, especially pig barns in Minnesota are older. They were built in the 70s and 80s. There's a big push for hog production into the state around that time. But, our pigs are a lot bigger now and we're turning them over faster. So before, when you could raise maybe, 2 sets of hogs in a year, now we're getting 2.5, almost 3. So that means the manure storages are filling up more quickly and they no longer have a year worth of storage in these particular systems. And hog manure, like we saw earlier, has a really high inorganic nitrogen content on average, which means it acts more like a fertilizer source, which means that the nitrogen is really readily plant available and probably should be applied closer to crop uptake. Research in Ohio, I don't want to claim that we're the first ones that did this. Glenn Arnold in Ohio started this first, and he showed some really good success. They actually had a lot of on-farm trials from 2014 to 2019. They had strips where they did swine manure that was side dressed, and they had strips where they had 28% of urea ammonium nitrate, which is a commercial fertilizer, that was side dressed. And the 6-year average shows that they had a 17 bushel per acre difference where swine manure was applied compared to the fertilizer, and it was higher where the swine manure was applied. So with these promising results, he said, hey, let's try it. Let's try it in Minnesota. Let's just see what happens. So we're evaluating it in a couple different ways. I'll first talk about our first study, which was an on-farm study using a drag hose application system. Then we did some small plots where we dragged a full manure hose over corn at different growth stages just to see, at what point do we kill corn? We probably shouldn't be doing this. And then finally, we have an on-farm study using tankers, which is shown here, to look at different timing for corn manure application. So our first study was all full-scale equipment. So we actually convinced a farmer to try this out. They have an older style hog barn. They're looking to get manure applied at different times of the year. Usually they have to find a neighbor who maybe grows wheat or sweet corn or something that comes off the field early and then get the manure applied in the summer. He was very interested in this because this means that maybe he could use that manure for 1 or 2 of his fields instead that's in corn. So this farmer typically puts on 40 pounds of nitrogen in starter fertilizer. So we side dressed an additional 140 pounds of nitrogen at the V4, V5 growth stage. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. We were going into second year corn after corn. In this case, he was growing a 3-year rotation, corn, soybean. So in both years that we did this, we went into the second year of corn to side dress it. We did big strips across the field. We did swine manure with a drag line system, and the drag line system is what is shown here at the bottom. It's where instead of having a big tank that is really heavy and pulling it through the field, they have a big 6-inch hose that is attached to a pumping system back at the barn, or it can be attached to a truck full of manure, whatever you want to do. And then it is dragged kind of throughout the field. And that's the big concern, is you have this big hose that's now being pulled over the corn. Is that going to be a problem? So we said, why not just go full on with this and try it out? The farmer typically side dresses the anhydrous ammonia, so this is his standard practice. He also wanted to try out strips with liquid UAN. In Minnesota, we typically have access to 32%. Again, UAN is urea ammonium nitrate. And then we convinced him to do big strips with no nitrogen that was side dressed. Again, just to make sure that the nitrogen was in fact improving crop yields, but that it was causing an effect at all. Just to show you, this is a picture of corn that was at the V4 growth stage. Typically, we stage corn by counting the leaf collars. So we have the first leaf here, that's V1. Second leaf collar is here, V2. Third leaf collar is here, V3. And the fourth leaf collar has just formed here. But you see there's another leaf already grown out, but the collar for that leaf hasn't formed yet. So that's why we call this V4 corn. So it's getting fairly big. It was getting a little later than I would have liked for application, but this is what we did in both years. And then I hope this video comes across okay. I just want to show you what it looks like to drag this hose. We applied 12 rows up with manure, and then the manure applicator turned around and turned back and dragged the hose over the corn. And that was one strip for us. Oh, it didn't seem to play there. There we go. So I'm standing next to the farmer, the first strip that we did, and I'm like, man, are you sure that we could do this? You really want us to do this? And he's like, yeah, we got to try it. All in the name of science. So you can see that a lot of the corn just bounced back up. It was hardly damaged at all. Some corn did have soil dragged over it. So again, we were standing there like, man, do you really want us to do this? But he was all for it. So we kept moving. This is an aerial photograph taken in July of that same year. You can see the big no nitrogen strips, which are labeled here. I have 2 reps labeled, but we did do 4 replicates across this field. We have anhydrous ammonia, which is looking, this is a farmer's traditional practice. It's very green. We have our control plots. We have the UAN, which looks very green. And then we have our swine manure. And you can tell exactly where they didn't bring enough hose. So we had to turn around the field. The farmer came back in and filled it in with anhydrous in that strip though. But you can see exactly where they turned around and came back. There is definitely some striping in these swine manure plots. I saw this and I was like, oh man, this is not going to look good. The yield is not going to look good. This is the second year we did this. The field that we did this last year was actually up here. We did this kind of catacorner here in this next field. And again, you can see exactly where the manure haulers turned around and went back, and you can still see some striping. UAN plots looked really good. Anhydrous ammonia plots looked really good. And you can see the big strips of light green where the corn was deficient because we did not side dress any additional N in those plots. This was again a very wet year. You can see all the drowned out sites in this particular field. So I'll show you corn yields first of the first year. This is 2018. AA stands for anhydrous ammonia, farmer's traditional practice. The drag line is the swine manure. The UAN is liquid UAN, urea ammonium nitrate. And then we have the control that had no additional nitrogen side dressed. So overall, if it has a letter above it that's the same, that means there's no statistical difference across those treatments. If there's a different letter, then it is statistically different. So overall, I was actually really pleased. Our highest yield was 208 bushels per acre, but dragline and UAN were the same at 205. So we only saw a very minimal yield difference, and statistically, they were not different. Over 200 bushels per acre in that field that particular year. One thing I want to point out though is the control. It only had that 40 pounds of nitrogen at the beginning. It didn't have any other nitrogen, and it still got 141 bushels per acre, which that's really good considering this is a very fertile field. And then 2019 happened. Again, if you remember, I talked about these being very wet years. Here we have anhydrous ammonia, dragline, UAN, and the control again. You can see the control was a lot lower, closer to 90 pounds or 90 bushels per acre. Unfortunately, anhydrous ammonia was the clear winner at 228 bushels per acre. UAN was still statistically the same at 208, but we did see a yield reduction with the dragline swine manure. It's like, what the heck happened here? I called the manure applicator. Is like, do you know what's going on? He's like, oh, forgot to tell you that they actually had done the calculations wrong, where they had been using a application bar that was shorter prior to coming to our field and forgot to put in that they were using a longer bar. So they had recorded how many gallons per acre they had applied, but they hadn't upped the rate, so to speak, to go over that wider width. So when we did the calculations, we actually found out that they had applied 50 pounds less of nitrogen per acre than we had asked them to. So, that probably is one of the main reasons why we saw such a yield reduction, you apply 50 pounds less of nitrogen, you're probably going to get a lower yield. So overall, we were feeling pretty good about this, despite the, application issues that we saw, and despite the striping. These are all application things that we think we can fit or fix, with equipment and making some adjustments. So we felt pretty good about that. Just to quickly finish up what some of the other research we did, we wanted to see, what's the latest you can take a drag hose over corn before you start having problems. So we took a manure hose, dragged it behind a tractor over corn at different growth stages. Here you can see around V1, and then this is around V6. Then we took an aerial photograph here later in the season, and you can see exactly where V5 was. Corn looks pretty damaged, and you can see exactly where V6 was. The corn was very damaged and hardly grew after we dragged it. Here's our grain yields following those trials. We did this over 4 site years, 2 different locations. Here's our grain yield of bushels per acre. The first bar in each of these, we did 2 different hybrids of corn. The first bar is where nothing was dragged. So you can see that overall dragging at V1, V2, V3, regardless of hybrid, statistically didn't have really any difference than our no dragged controls. For one of our hybrids, V4 started to be problematic. Yield was reduced, and this is statistically. For the other hybrid, it was V5 and V6. The reason is because the growing point of corn stays below the soil surface until about V5. Once it starts coming up above the surface, once it's damaged, it's not going to grow any further. So even though we almost completely ripped off some of the corn, like it was completely gone, it was wild, it still kept growing back, and it actually didn't hamper yield at all. It was once that growing point was potentially damaged when it didn't grow back anymore. So overall, you can safely apply with a drag hose up through V3, and some cases you can get away with V4. So then we said, all right, we can do it with a drag hose. What about a tanker? A tanker could go into corn much later than a drag hose could. So we worked with the same farmer, lined up a big manure tanker. This is a 4,200 gallon tanker. Did pretty much the same experiment, put starter fertilizer down. We did up the nitrogen rate because recommendations in our state had changed at that time to 155 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And then we went in at V1, V4, V7. So first leaf collar established, 4th leaf collar established, 7th. We did miss V1 in 2021 because the pump broke. We couldn't get manure applied. By the time it was fixed, the corn had already outgrown us. So I'm only going to show you V4 and V7. And we compared that to the farmer's traditional practice of doing anhydrous ammonia. And he usually goes in around V4 or V5. We did this 2 years. So this is averaged over 2 years. And the anhydrous ammonia always significantly outperformed our manure applied at V4 and V7. 212 bushels per acre versus less than 200 for both of these. Couple reasons. One is that, this is a big heavy tank. There's probably significant soil compaction issues, especially you can see that the tractor has 4 tires. So there'll be 4 rows impacted by this. And then the manure tank also has a bunch of tires, but they're also out and line up with one of the tractor tires. So there's a lot of compaction that happens in that row. And we noticed that you can't really see it in the pictures and have a good picture of this, but the injection wasn't very clean in those rows. It's almost like it was so compacted that the injector was having a hard time getting the manure beneath the soil surface. So we think that there was probably some volatilization that was happening in those rows on top of the compaction. So we think that's maybe what was driving that down, but we're still pulling together a lot of this data to see if we can tease out what was going on. So overall lessons learned, soy manure is a great side dressing source. We're still working on dairy manure to see how that is. You can safely inject manure up to V3 with a dragline system, maybe V4. Tanker application may reduce yield. There may be some things that we can still work on to see if we can, better that. But overall, thanks to my staff and crew who are amazing to work with. Thanks to our funding sources. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. As Gurpal mentioned, I'm on Twitter at ManureProf. And if you're interested in seeing some of our research, some of it we try to get online to do virtual kind of tours. So you can see that at z.umn.edu/manure research. So with that, I know I went a little bit over, but hopefully we still have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Melissa. Good job. Do we have any, Marty, do we have 4 or 5 minutes? Did you say we need to leave at
5 minutes for a few questions here? That would be great.
Okay, 5 minutes. Who has questions for Melissa?
I got a question online if there's no one in the room.
Oh, I knew you were going to have a question raised. Go
I
for
knew you did.
it.
Super interesting work, really nice integrated project where you're looking at all these different factors from compaction to mineralization rate. So kudos on taking that broad view. Although I guess a broader view might figure out how not to have CAFOs and have manure be a problem instead of a resource, but that's probably a little beyond pay scale at this point.
I was going to say it's a little beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, but that's kind of where we need to go, long term. So I missed, there was big differences in the application. So these were all injected liquids that you were doing. Is that right?
So
Yeah.
for the side dressing, it was all injected liquids. For the first study that I talked about, we all surface broadcast that and then
Okay.
incorporated
So-
it within
so
12
different-
hours.
So different factors could be at play there in terms of losses. So when you calculated this is always a problem with manure, you're trying to put on the same amount of available nitrogen, right? That's your target. And it's a bunch of fudge factors. So which fudge factors did you use? The ones that were the official ones or the ones that you found out from your research? They
So
were
just to be
completely different, right?
just to be consistent, we use the ones that we're officially using in our
Ones
state.
that, as far as you can tell, are completely wrong.
Yes.
Okay, so had you used the ones, you would have applied a much higher rate.
Potentially. I think
I mean, most of
there's
them
also the
are
word of
much lower,
caution
right? I
too.
mean, the percentage available nitrogen that your experiments showed from the nitrogen fertilizer equivalency was mostly quite a bit lower, right? Than the
Yeah, I like to
Maybe
put the word of caution though. We had 2 really, really wet years and there
I
is
get that.
going to be a
I
huge
get
climate
that.
variability.
Yeah, and
these.
I don't know how wet. I think those years were also pretty wet, what you were doing these in. It's just wetter. You're getting heavy rains, right?
Yeah.
So one thing I'm assuming you didn't mention cover crops. So in Minnesota, cover crops are not a standard part of the corn rotation like they should be. That
Yeah,
could
we're
very
running
well
about
change the
2%.
picture because a lot of that manure mineralization is going to keep on going and past when the corn is finished taking it up, which is pretty early actually when it starts senescing, and actually just the beginning of senescing during grain fill, the uptake is pretty much ceased, and so that nitrogen keeps coming out, and then that gets lost over the winter, whereas a cover crop might be able to cycle that back in. So
Yeah, that's
So
one
that's
of our
one-
projects we didn't get to talk as
yeah,
much
so
about.
that's one question. How you factor that in. The other one is
Hey Ray, sorry to cut you off, but I think
okay,
we need to
all right.
get,
Well, let's talk about this, Melissa, okay?
you know,
Yeah,
Melissa,
we'll
you can
catch up
send
at some
an
point,
email,
Yeah.
and
I was
schedule.
going to ask about the second, third, fourth years, because people are usually applying manure repeatedly to the same field, and how much they take into account those earlier applications.
So hey Marty, does anyone in the room have any questions for Melissa?
Actually, I have a question I'd like to ask.
Okay, go for it. Go for it.
In your first experiment that you described, Melissa, there's a significant part of this nitrogen that wasn't taken up. Do you have a sense? You mentioned possibility of leaching versus volatilization, denitrification. Do you have a sense of what you think is the dominant factor? How is most of this moving into the groundwater, or are the soils such that in a wet year you're really going to be driving a lot of denitrification in those sites?
So in our Lamberton site, there was definitely a lot of ponding even right nearby our field. So I'm thinking that there was probably a good bit of denitrification happening. Leaching obviously in wet years is a big one as well. The volatilization I think was probably pretty standardized because we treated all the manure application the same in that regard. But that certainly could be a factor as well.
Thank you.
And Marty, if anyone else has questions in the room, I think we got 1 minute.
Anyone else have a question here?
I have a quick question, like sort of a practical question, like with the drag hose method. Is there a way that you could just suspend the drag hose a little bit above the surface so that it wasn't dragging over the corn physically?
So in that case, it's really heavy, especially because they could be dragging these like, almost half a mile across these fields. Our fields in the Midwest are very big compared to in Maryland. There is a company that actually has figured out a way where they drag the hose out and then it's on a swing arm. So then it kind of opens up the swing arm, and as it's coming back, it's being rolled back up so it stays in the same row. So that's one thing that people have been working on. It's a little expensive at this time. So it's like, will this take off, that people really want to get to do this? And then maybe it might be worth it, especially if there's commercial haulers who are doing multiple fields doing this. So there are people starting to look into it. We're starting to gain a little bit steam in that regard.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. I think her email is there. So Ray, I encourage you to send an email and schedule a Zoom call. Anyone else have any questions for Melissa that were not answered today? Please feel free to reach out. She's very active on Twitter. So go follow her. I'm hoping that she will probably gain a few followers in the process. But thank you again for being here. Thank you for agreeing to give this presentation. Great job.
Yeah, thank you. And as mentioned, I'm always happy to answer questions. I email or via Twitter, whatever you want.
Thank you again.
Okay, Marty, over to you.